Okay, so this is a quote-unquote fireside chat sort of format here, guys. So please do fire in your questions. I know a lot of people were very interested about this. Kate has a wealth of experience in this area, so please ping over the questions. I'll start with a few of mine, but then I'll go to the chat for the rest of them. So Kate, if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself, your role and your background.
Good morning, everyone. So I have worked in CSR for the last 20 years. A lot of that was fairly unintentional because for those of you who can think back 20 years, you'll know that the CSR sector has changed hugely over that time. So after I graduated, I had a few quite temporary type roles and contracts in the charity sector. And then one of my first job that really launched my CSR career was with an organisation called ELBA, the East London Business Alliance. And their whole role, as it is still today, was around building corporate community partnerships between local communities in East London and the corporate sector. So largely City and Canary Wharf-based firms, certainly back then, although it's very much grown now. That launched me on my way into CSR, so it wasn't planned. I didn't really know what that was until I joined there. I moved in-house into the banking sector, originally to Morgan Stanley for a few years, where I was the volunteer manager there. I plugged that in because I know this is about volunteering. And then after a couple of years there, I moved to Credit Suisse, where I had various roles, including a little bit of client philanthropy. I launched their global initiatives, did some grant making, and eventually ended up as head of what they called corporate citizenship there, so looking after the corporate foundation, the employee giving programs, including a very large Charity of the Year program, as well as volunteering. A couple of years ago, I left CS as a good leaver. It was a great career, just time to move on, and I joined CVC, where I am today. So my role encompasses looking after our own corporate philanthropy program, so sort of corporate foundation type structures, our employee programs, including matching and volunteering, but also, which has been a huge personal interest of mine, we work with, as a private equity firm, we have a portfolio of companies, and we will work with them to support the development of their CSR programs. So rather than just being focused on the finance sector, which had been my background, I work across multiple industries now, which is hugely interesting. Just a quick nod to my volunteering. Throughout my career, I've always volunteered. I'm currently a trustee of the DHL UK Foundation, so another corporate foundation, as well as being a school governor, and my other great passion, which is as a netball coach.
Fantastic. That's great. Thank you very much, Kate. So, look, you mentioned your current role at CVC. So I'm sure you get people reach out to you looking for potentially corporate volunteering opportunities or potentially funding as well and partnerships. So what is it that you are looking for when that sort of situation occurs?
It's always a great question, and actually there's no one simple answer to that because it will always depend on what the strategy of the initiative is for. But there are a couple of key principles that I always adhere to. So first and foremost, does it meet the mission and criteria? Secondly, the sort of why us? Why us as a funder opposed to a different funder or a different type of funder? And then thirdly, what does a partnership and relationship look like? So just taking a little bit more time on each of those. I think the first one, and by the way, it is in that order as well, if you know, in terms of thinking about through those three steps. So first and foremost, if I take CVC as an example, our corporate foundation program has a mission of supporting disadvantaged young people through education and employability. So clearly we are looking to support that. But more than that, I was talking to somebody in the break just now. We're relative generalists. We're funders. We don't know everything. We're a relatively small team. It is people like yourselves who are the experts in the field. So when we talk to a charity partner, I'm really looking to them to educate us, tell us what's the problem, why is it an issue. For us, we often hear a lot about the education attainment gap, and when you look at socioeconomic differences between young people, for one example. We also want to understand the solutions, what the data is telling us, what your model is telling us. So there's a huge education piece for us in understanding what that means by do you meet the criteria. So it sounds like a tick box, but actually it's far more involved. So that's, and there are different strategies as well. So any questions, please do ask me about that. Secondly, I talked about why us. And I say that because corporate partners, and perhaps that's why some of us here today, are not always the easiest to work with. We are often looking to build partnerships and relationships, but we can offer different types of things. So one of the things I often get told when I ask people, why us? They will say things like, you're relatively small, you're relatively nimble, we can build a relationship, but I think what's important is to sort of tell us why. I always find it really interesting. When you watch TV programs and they're asking you to vote and they say, oh, why should I vote for you, Ash? And they go, because I'm having a great time. And I always think, well, why is that relevant to me? It's sort of the same thing. If your answer to me is, we want to work with you because we're trying to diversify our funding streams, that's a really valid answer. The reason it's important to me is because I want you to be financially stable and strong. So that's what you're trying to tell us, is that the reason we want to work with you is because you're adding something, opposed to working with a different type of funder, particularly because the corporate sector in relation to other funding sources is not that big. And then finally, it's really about what a relationship is going to be like. So corporates and businesses, in my experience, do tend to be quite active funders. We want a relationship. We're not going to be silent. And I think sometimes people do come with assumptions around what that means, and my advice would please try and avoid those assumptions about what that looks like, and really enter into as much of a dialogue and conversation about what that means. And I think at a very, very simple level, it's about communication and relationships. We want to have a partnership with you, and that may include volunteering. That's often a big part of that, but it may be other things. It may be around awareness raising. It may be about helping you meet your mission in some way. It may be as simple as wanting to share other resources we have available, like office space or a network. I always think that's a very underutilized part of what we have is our network, which is often large and different from yours, so accessing those sort of things. So those are the three things we'll often talk about when we're looking for a partnership. And then it's not really a fourth point, but the other thing we will talk about is due diligence, which it's not the fun, exciting bit, but it is always helpful to just have your house in order and be ready to answer questions. And I think, just wanted to reflect, actually, a number of people have talked about failure and things. We always love it when people can be really open. If there's something that is there that maybe you didn't have the best financial year last year, or maybe there's a bit of negative news, address it up front and have an open, honest conversation, because that, to me, that transparency is far more valuable than you trying to show your best self. Was it Matt who said that? Somebody said something about always showing your best self. Actually having that open conversation is very helpful.
No, that really resonates, and I think that transparency element is key. So some of the things you mentioned, actually, Kate, this is kind of deviating from what we actually had in front of me here, but it sounds like you also want people to make it as easy for you to kind of make that sell internally, but also to go, yeah, cool, we can do this. So almost come with you with like, right, this is exactly how we could work together. Is there an element of making your life easy?
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, it's interesting. Were you standing behind me during the break talking about this? I think one of the things to be mindful of is whoever you're speaking to will have multiple stakeholders themselves. And so often, I will be in a situation where I'll be talking to a charity and I've got my questions and my experience, but I've also got a range of anything from employees who want to engage, management, the ultimate decision makers. Most corporates are going to have some sort of approval process, committees and all those sort of things. And hopefully, if I'm doing my job well, I will know what interests them, what they're likely to engage with. Sometimes I get curveballs. I'm like, where did that question come from? And so I'll be looking to you to help me answer those questions. So sometimes my most sort of difficult questions is actually because I want you to arm me with the answer, and I want you to be honest and realistic with me, both in terms of what you're setting out to do, what your mission is, what you can achieve, what impact looks like, but also what a partnership could look like. I think some of the kind of over the years, you always hear lots of people saying, "Oh, but they want volunteering and it's not realistic." Great that you know that. Have that conversation. Be open about what is, because it's often that's the information I need to be talking to my stakeholders, just as much as I want those brilliant, impactful, powerful statements for you, which I can also be communicating and educating my stakeholders and decision makers with.
That's great. So you've kind of talked about the things that you're looking for, and obviously that's going to hopefully help a lot of people in the room when they're thinking about some of the corporate partnerships they might look at to put in place. But how does that conversation start? Where, how, what would you hope to kind of see in terms of that initial touch point?
Do you know, I think this is a really great question and a big question. One of the things, knowing that you were likely to ask this thing, I wanted to acknowledge straight off is that I think it's difficult. Corporates and businesses are opaque. We don't helpfully put on our websites, "Hey, this is how you apply, this is what you have to do, here's the names of all the people you should contact and exactly what we want to see." And that's the truth, right? If you've tried to prospect corporates, you'll know that. It's not necessarily because the information isn't there, it's just not the style of how we publish it. Maybe there's a little bit of concern about being inundated, all of those sort of things. But I would do your research, go out there and look at, we know about the internet, have a look at corporate foundations. If you're a corporate foundation in the UK, you're on the Charity Commission website, your reports out there, your accounts are out there. Social media is great. I mean, companies are always spinning stuff out in LinkedIn. And also other charities that you are similar to, who's funding them, where are those prospects where you might be able to start conversations. So in terms of where you start, that would be sort of where I'd start from a research point of view. And then in terms of actually connecting, again, like I said, it's not easy. There isn't a one route portal. I would genuinely talk about networks. There are many routes into a company. Lots and lots of companies do work through their stakeholders, whether it's customers, whether it's their employees. A lot of our referrals come internally, so people saying, "I'm interested in this," and really, thinking about or other charity partners that they're already working with. So what I do, if I've got a new initiative, I don't often do a big open request for proposals. The most likely thing when I'm starting to think about doing that is I go and talk to people I know, my network. So it will include our current charity partners. Who have you seen that's doing great work? Who do? It'll include other funders, and we all have our own little, just like I'm sure you have your networks, we all have ours, and we share and share alike. And then as well as what I can find publicly out there in terms of who's doing great work and having that presence, and whether it be social media or beyond. So that's certainly where I'd start. And I would also, just in those initial conversations, I would think about your entry point as well. So I know that you hopefully want to get to a point where you're talking about, £50,000 grants, £100,000 grant, but that's not where most relationships start. And a lot of where our entry points are around things like smaller grant programs. So that's, they're both a great way to support organisations, but they're also, for us, a pipeline. I'm going to be honest, a lot of those small grant programs I've started become my pipeline for future longer-term relationships. Same with matching programs and volunteer programs. I can talk about volunteering because I know that the resource that goes into these things is not insignificant, so you're always trying to balance what is a reasonable kind of resource outlay with the risk of whether you are successful in the long run or not. But those are really, relatively, and I say relatively easy entry points, which will often be where we will look to build those longer term, bigger relationships with.
Thank you, that's super helpful. You mentioned actually obviously the volunteering side, and I think sometimes what you see is actually the volunteering is sort of just a necessary byproduct to what is really wanted, right? But, you know, in terms of that, how do you think about the corporate volunteering? You know, what are you looking for in that space? I know it will be different across the board, but yeah, if you could share some light there.
I think it's a very fair comment. And I'd say, you asked me not to talk about it across the board, but I do think it's about where it comes in that conversation. So, for example, if you're talking to, and I mentioned right at the outset about strategy. So if you talk to a professional services type company, their core strategy is their pro bono work. That is what they're offering. Your legal firms, your consultancies. I was speaking to Bain recently, and that's what they do. And they have internal programs. And so they are going to organizations who they want to know have got clarity around how they can use that resource really well. In contrast, obviously this is just close friends here, but to go through the internal workings, if I'm really brutally honest about where I work currently, in London so we're based in London, we don't have any headcount. I mean, there's lots of people who work flexibly and stuff now, but that's where our office is in the UK. And there's about 200 people, right? So in the UK, I don't need thousands of volunteering, right? And I know that you could come up with 10 great opportunities that look amazing, and I can hugely respect as a professional in the sector and know that I could go back, but I've only got 200 people to ask, and maybe they're not available, it doesn't resonate, and we're not going to actually get anything there. So for us, it is very much, if you think through those 3 points I look for, I'm really looking for the first two, the mission, the criteria, that sort of funding first. And you're right, the volunteering then is, tell us what works for you. And how that can resonate for us. And we do get good volunteering opportunities with our partners, but we're both sides are constantly looking to manage that expectation around, one, what our charity partners can deliver, but also I don't want them doing loads of work knowing that in reality, I'm going to get 2 mentors. I don't need 20 mentoring spaces, I need 2. And and there's going to be certain flexibility.
That's great. I mean, look, I'm actually going to dive into some of the questions that you guys are kindly putting on the chat because they're coming in thick and fast. So, right, got to be on your toes now. Okay, so thank you, Kaylee, for this one. When CSR programs are being developed, is there any input from community groups, the third sector, on what KPIs will be the most impactful?
Yeah, I mean, yes. I mean, again, I can't overly talk in generalizations because, of course, every single business and company is different. What I found really interesting recently, just to draw on some experiences, the private equity is a sector, as I said, that's where I work in, is relatively new. There aren't, probably about 30 years the sector's been working. And what's really interesting, in the last year or two, many firms have suddenly woken up to the fact that they want to have a corporate foundation and are thinking about their programs. And the truth is that most of them are like us. We've got 3 people who work in my team. That's it. So absolutely we would be looking to our partners to help inform what our KPIs are. And often, certainly when I'm looking at our monitoring and reporting, we don't have overarching KPIs for our work, and it's a little bit of a frustration because we'd love to talk about it. We'd love to say we did this, but we're not. We haven't done anything really. We funded great partners to achieve that. So absolutely, we want to understand your KPIs and why they're important, and really inform that. But what I would say is that and look, this is no secret. I'm telling you stuff that data is really hugely helpful, and being able to talk about your impact in terms of those KPIs and how they correlate to the problem you're looking to address is what resonates certainly with my stakeholders. I hope that answers your question.
That's great. So the next one that we've got is from Charlotte. How can we best engage with businesses outside of traditional CSR volunteering? There are big skill gaps within the sector: marketing, recruitment, digital skills, which could be plugged by expert knowledge from the private sector?
This is something I've spent a lot of time thinking about over the years. I think there are some companies who do it brilliantly. I've sort of mentioned some of the big names in it, the professional services firms, and I think there's a certain element that it suits their working style. If you are like a managing consultant or something, you may well have a project with a client and then you'll be off that and then you'll have space to take on a pro bono case, or you'll be managing 2 or 3 different things, and you can really leverage those kind of relationships. So those are the types of organizations you can do that with. I think you can do it really successfully with other types of organizations as well, but I think it's about them being flexible about how they work and how they offer things. So certainly in the bigger organizations, so both at Credit Suisse and Morgan Stanley, they had pro bono programs. And I think what we learned was the importance of the 2 roles. So the 2 roles, I mean, is my role, the sort of corporate social responsibility professional, however big the team is, we can give it different names. And then there's what would be sort of the corporate partnership or role, whether that's your full-time or other role in the charity. And I worked with a great fundraiser, Katie, a few years back. I always remember what she said to me, and she said, I've worked it out now, Kate. We had a big partnership. We were both investing quite a lot of time. And she said, your role is to be an advocate for us in your organization. So when we need something, whether it's fundraising or volunteering, whatever, is that I go out there and I make their case for them. And I go and try and find the right people to engage with the right skill sets and so on and so forth. But my role, Katie was saying, is to do the same in the charity sector. So the best skills-based volunteering programs that I've seen, whether it's pro bono or more kind of consultancy or whatever, there's a technical definition some people worry about, have been where the charity has been really good at investing the appropriate amount of time and resource about going and understanding their own needs and designing a sort of what their request is, what that kind of idea is, so that there is an opportunity to engage. You do get things like, people say to me, oh, we need help with HR. And I'm like, I think everybody needs help with HR. You know, what does it, opposed to somebody saying, we don't have a good performance management system. We know that we're a growing organization. You know, we need to invest some time and energy. Can you help with that? I mean, even if you don't have more of a project description than that's a starting point for me to bring an expert in. So I think it really is about that investment in that.
And actually, if I could, just because I had a recent experience on this from the Volunteero side that worth feeding back to you, you don't just have to think to the corporates to plug that gap. You might be very surprised to find out who your actual volunteers are and what they do and what skills that they already possess. So I would just advise that, because we had an organisation that had around 200 volunteers. They had no idea. They had 3 lawyers, a CFO, and all these other different people in their voluntary force. And they suddenly now have a bit of pro bono advice here and there, someone to work on their kind of cash projections and things like that. So also look internally and with your existing volunteers on that one, I think. So from David, do corporate funders partner with community interest companies? And does this differ from working with charities? Again, it probably depends on the company. So we certainly do. I think we would look at it from, you'd probably pause a little bit so that you understood what that meant and how that company is set up. There will be others who don't. I definitely have spoken to corporate foundations or organizations where that is just, against their articles. They've said they fund registered charities and that's what they do, and the idea of looking at anything that is not that organization. So I think it is, as much as possible, it is about going out there and looking at doing your research into this. I know I do want to acknowledge, I know it's not easy, there's not a one-stop shop on where you find out this information, but really looking, at what other community interest companies have got successful partnerships. And even if you're not prospecting that particular corporate, is go and talk to them about
why they do it and how they do it, and do they know anybody else who you might be a fit for, I think would be where I'd look at it. And ultimately, it is about, you can have a go at making the business case. I think when, I know a few years back, when nobody really knew what a CIC was, and you'd sort of kind of go, what does that mean? We were constantly educating. Going back to that point that I was talking about, understanding, I get most of my information, my knowledge that I've gained over the years has been from my charity partners. It's not been from other corporates. It's been from you.
So I've actually just been sat here trying to figure out what the acronym COTY stands for. And now I've figured it out, we can ask this question. So, how can small charities get on the radar of corporates? Often, for example, Charity of the Year goes to the big names and causes. I get why. And that's from Janet.
Yeah, thanks, Janet. I think it's a great question. And I think it's a really interesting one. One thing, like I said, we ran a Charity of the Year program for years, and I learnt the best thing I could do for charity partners was be really, really honest about what the partnership was, because not to oversell myself, but it was we raised the lowest I ever raised through that partnership was just under 700,000. We went over $1 million in a year on several occasions, and it was sort of in that order of magnitude. However, it was a demanding partnership, and if struggling, put on fundraising events and putting a lot of resource behind it, that's clearly not going to be right for everybody. So it is. Charity of the Year programs, I think you need to be honest that they are not a straight grant. But you know this already, but it's not the same as having like a grant partnership where you're just getting the funding and then building a partnership around that core funding. It's about raising that money and everything that goes into event fundraising, community fundraising, and all those other things. I think for small charities, I do understand the challenge, and I think it goes back to a lot of the advice I've already touched on, that it is about networks. I think it's about really looking at what it is, who would be the right partners for you. So you can look at kind of where we support, like what kind of mission we have, but I would start often with who are your local employers, who are your local businesses. Many companies, geography is a big question. I'm happy to talk about that more broadly, but many will have, even if they have big international programs, will often have local programs as well that are really about recognizing where their businesses are, where their employees live, and will have opportunities to unlock funds from those, and work through that, and ultimately really thinking about who you might already know at companies who could help open that door. And I think it is okay to ask somebody who works at the company, could you introduce me to somebody? Please don't go onto LinkedIn and find everybody that works at that company. I mean, every now and then I get hit from like 50 different directions, and it's clear somebody's gone onto LinkedIn and worked out what the root of our email addresses are, and then blitz everybody that as a gatekeeper, that doesn't help. But I do think having, utilising those networks. So I'm sorry, it's not a very easy answer, as in there's not a good entry point, but I do think really using those networks, thinking about those small grant programs, those matching programs, those volunteer programs, who else they're working with, going and talking to them, it keeps coming back to that, I think.
Fantastic. It's got one here from Rob. Most employee volunteering is formal volunteering. In the US, there is a growing trend to companies supporting informal volunteering, for example, through paid social justice time off initiatives for employees to support direct action. What are your views on this, and whether and how corporates should support this in the UK?
Rob, if I get the answer to this question, if I'm not hitting it, please shout and tell me wherever you are. I think, interesting enough, a lot of all the companies I've worked for have had their own volunteering programs that are coordinated and organised. I guess that's what we mean by formal volunteering, by corporate partnership teams and the like. So people like myself, and I think that there is the value in that is that we are able to build those partnerships with our grant partners or charity partners or what have you. We can add value, we can have depth in the partnership, and hopefully help create more impact for those partners. In addition to that, every company I have worked for has also always had a provision for recognising employees' own volunteering and philanthropic interests. And that includes time off for volunteering. Not every company has them. We don't currently have a formal policy. And that's okay for me, because I think the culture around volunteering is, it's okay to agree that with your manager and be flexible. I think 20 years ago it was kind of needed, that formal leave. Now I find it's more of it gives people the confidence, because if they don't feel comfortable asking for it, they can, as a sort of flexible arrangement, they can take their volunteer leave to do that. And then that, within that, there's usually an element of trust about how you spend your time. In terms of volunteering, we hope that people are doing it to create social impact or what have you. And also there's, interesting enough, often financial recognition for that. So whether that be CVC, we have a very generous matching program. As it's a little tip there, if you've got anybody at CVC who supports you either volunteering or through donations, please let me know, because we can unlock the matching for that. And we will sort of financially match volunteer time. And I've seen that in a number of companies. But also, if I use DHL, as I mentioned, I'm a trustee there, it's more like a small kind of grants program, where if you volunteer a certain number of hours, you can apply for a small grant that will be unlocked for those organisations. So that sort of informal volunteering, but I mentioned strategy a few times. The strategy behind that is not about creating some headline sort of impact. It is about employee choice. It is about recognising the interests of the employees generally, I would say. I hope that was what you were asking.
I can see him and nodding in the back there. So yeah, you've done a good job. So yeah, look, we've still got questions coming through, so we'll take a few more. So we've got one here from Christy. Kate, you mentioned corporates being able to support their charity partners with awareness raising. Can you expand on this and give a few examples of what this looks like in practice?
Yeah, I'm really happy. And I think it's interesting, because I think people often panic about volunteering, particularly if you're not already set up. If you've got kind of easy, bespoke things people can, not bespoke, off-the-shelf things to plug into. But when you're being asked to think creatively about, particularly lighter touch volunteering, where people kind of want to build awareness and for employees or other stakeholders to know about you, but as a partner they want that recognition that the CSR is building that internal culture and playing into that, but they don't want to put people off by big kind of time or other commitments. It's difficult to think about that, and I think awareness raising and education is quite a powerful way of doing that. So sometimes it can be about helping you meet your own mission, and a good example for that is I had a partnership a good few years back with the NSPCC. The funding was going towards their schools awareness programs, so if anybody's got young kids, those kind of programs. Do you remember, I don't know, you don't have young kids, the Pantasaur sort of thing, where we're talking about age-appropriate discussions around ultimately very difficult topics around abuse and other things, and raising awareness around people about how to ask for help and things. So one of the aims the NSPCC had was they wanted to get into every primary school in the country, and so they were talking to my 5,000 employees at the bank as about being parent ambassadors, to go in and raise that with the school and say, is there something where you would be interested in, help facilitate that, maybe add a bit of capacity around organising that, we know schools as, finding the time and the energy to organise within a busy schedule. So that was a great, very direct link to the partnership we were funding, but also actually helping raise helping the charity meet their mission in terms of doing that. I think sometimes it's often just lower level awarenesses. I'm not going to try and talk about social media when you've had such experts talk about it, but again, it's something about you've got a kind of a captive audience to a certain extent, in terms of utilising a company's internal communications for your own external communication purposes. So putting your campaigns through a partnership, asking us to raise awareness, but then with links to the external campaigns in terms of whether that be your advocacy work or your education work, or whether it be fundraising, so your big Christmas campaign or whatever it might be. So it's those types of things that I would be sort of talking about when I'm thinking about that.
Great. So the next one comes from Lucy. To what extent do you think corporates would like a strategic approach to CSR? For example, with a central point, virtual or otherwise, that they can look to find opportunities in the VCSE in each area? Do you prefer building individual relationships with organisations, or would a strategic approach help?
In terms of to volunteering, or is that
this is approach to CSR. So I guess maybe we can talk about it, one, from a volunteering perspective, a central point of opportunities, but as well maybe if you're looking for potential grants to give out or something like that.
Yeah. Again, was it Lucy? Please tell me if I'm not quite understanding, or come and chat to me at lunch, what have you. In terms of answering the question, I think there is a lot of bespoke relationships that go on and partnership building. I often think that's why we get to have jobs. In truth, that if corporates could and employers could work directly with the charity and support the cause, then there wouldn't be the need for CSR departments and corporate partnership managers on the charity side of it. And I do think that there is a certain the variation you get between different companies in terms of what their aims are, what their policies are, realistically what the working cultures are in terms of what their employees could engage with through volunteering, and so on. It is that there is enough variation that there will always be a bespoke element to it, I think. Particularly when it comes to things like skills-based volunteering, and going in and, like you said, how do you know? It's easy to say, we want 10 marathon runners because hopefully, as long as somebody can get round, you don't necessarily need to be an accountant or what have you. But obviously, some things you're looking for very specific skills, experience, time commitments, and so on. I think from a broader point of view, in terms of that. Partnerships in general, including funding and things. Yeah, it would be great if there was somewhere where we could have more of a sense of things. Somebody asked earlier about small charities and stuff. There is a certain limit on how much attention and space and capacity we've got. I know there are large charities in the room. There is definitely, from a corporate partnerships point of view, there are definitely things we're working. I've mentioned demanding Charity of the Year fundraising, things that does suit larger organisations. But there are certain things where we want to work with smaller charities. Maybe it's because we want the local community. Or some of the programs I've run have often been around looking for that. We often talk. I work in the finance sector. People like terms like social return on investment because it's something that resonates in terms of the return on investment. So you're looking for organisations that have scalability. So you're therefore necessarily looking for smaller organisations or earlier stage organisations who've got great solutions that you're hoping to capacity build and things. But that is hard work to find them because they're not necessarily the ones who are most visible to you from a brand point of view or a network point of view.
Brilliant. Thank you for the question, Lucy. So, okay, this one's a bit of a challenging one. I hope you're ready for it. So, from Karina, and I think it's a great question, actually. So, from Karina, Karina asks, where does the motivation for corporates to become socially responsible come from? Is it mostly social obligation and scrutiny, or a genuine concern and a desire to help? And how can we, as charities and CICs, cultivate that motivation to our advantage?
It is a great question. I was honest enough to tell you how long I've been knocking around, and I would say that over those 20 years, the answer to that has changed. I feel lucky enough that I've worked for organisations where I have always felt that the desire was genuine, and again, there's lots of, a company's going to have lots of people who work for them and they're not all equally, motivated or responsive to these things, but the core essence, and maybe that's why I've always had a job, because they've invested in having a team, having somebody responsible for that, and cultivating a sense of expertise in the area within their own organisation. But I really do think it has changed. I think that narrative around what it means to... I always quite liked when I was at Credit Suisse, in fact we called it corporate citizenship, because I thought I got that, from as an individual citizen, you understand that there are obligations, we hopefully, obey laws and pay taxes and things like that. There are obligations about being a citizen and the rights that go with that. And then there's the additionality, the things we choose to do in terms of being members of our community, whether it's formal or not, whether we're talking sort of our context of volunteering or whether it's just being a good neighbour. And I felt that from a corporate citizenship was really quite when you thought about it in those terms, was a really helpful way of thinking about it in terms of, yes, of course, first and foremost, those organisations need to be governed well. They need to be working legally. They need to do, all of those things that we should rightly expect of them. But that there was also a desire to be working towards, in the way we do as individuals, further goals in terms of both. We keep talking about CSR, corporate social responsibility, but actually the wider ESG, the environmental, social and governance picture. And I think that narrative is only picked up in terms of the desire to do that. Now there are some cynical people out there. So of course you could always find the examples that would back that trend, but overall I would say yes. So to answer the second part of the question about you helping us understand that motivation, it really does come back to this point I've made before, which is about we are not the experts. Despite the fact I've worked, nearly all of the relationships that I've had in the charity sector have been around disadvantaged young people, education, employability. They've worked for very similar strategies. I would still never consider myself an expert, because then I come and talk to somebody like you about what you're seeing on the ground, what data you've got coming in. You can really help think that through, both from the sort of traditional philanthropy charity type view of CSR, but also much more of that core business strategy that I'm sure some of you are interested in as well, about how you help us think about how we behave as a supplier of whatever it is that we supply or service we provide in terms of delivering that well to stakeholders. And you see that increasingly in trying to build that good practice into the core business, as well as into the sort of additionality, I suppose, in what the CSR programs bring.
Fantastic. So look, we've got about 5 minutes or so, Kate. So we won't make it through all of them, but hopefully we'll make through another 2 questions or so. So we've got one here from Janet, and Janet asks, how much has the shift from CSR to ESG taken hold? CSR being a nice thing to do, whereas ESG has more accountability.
I think on the face of it, there's been a massive shift. I think, now companies talk about ESG where they weren't, I don't know when, but, certainly 10 years ago, that wasn't really a thing. They might have a bit of a sustainability program and a bit of a CSR program. So I think that outside view, yes, that shift sort of largely has happened. What I'd say, though, is if you dig under the surface, everybody is at different stages, and there's still a huge amount of work that needs to be done. Again, I don't want to overplug my organisation, but one of the things that we've done a lot with our portfolio companies is start bringing in as much consistency as we can. So it's now we require everybody to go through an ESG, I can't think of the right word, a company who measures ESG, can't think of the right word, but and have a rating and identify where they're performing well across the different workplace, community, environment, and so on stratas, and where they need to do more work. And what we're seeing in terms of then what's coming through about, we will then support and fund initiatives to try and help bring that up and bring up those practices. And what I'd say from what we're seeing come through is there's a lot of environmental things that are coming through in terms of understanding that. And it might be because it's easier to measure, it's more regulated. You know, I haven't done the research. That would be my instinct, that those things are coming in. But the fact that it is being seen as a whole conversation around ESG, opposed to just sustainability, CSR, workplace diversity, but that whole conversation is coming together, I think is definitely happening.
Fantastic. Okay, and so I think this will probably be the final question. This is from Graham, and I know Graham's travelled all the way from Scotland, so thank you, Graham. So Graham says, I worry that charities are often looking for a one-way relationship, help us. But I think there's opportunities for dual relationships with charities and social enterprises, being able to support corporates by providing expertise. Have you any experience of this? I think you've touched upon it actually already.
Yeah, and I would 100% agree with you. I think we often talk about kind of the dynamics in partnerships and relationships and all these types of things, and I think you're absolutely right. I mean, first of all, I would say it's a partnership. And, you know, maybe there's a bit of honesty. If you're looking for funding, of course, that, you know, we don't want to be taking money from you. We want to be giving money to you. So there will be the sort of inequalities, I suppose, in the right places in terms of which way the support is coming from. But I agree with you. I think that there, like you said, there are definitely things where your skills and knowledge, as much as I've talked about it from me as a funder and educating me and understanding the sector, but I think there are many great opportunities where essentially some of that service delivery comes in. And some of the easy examples are often things like health charities who come in and will do, if you're a mental health charity and maybe your core work is not with adults, maybe it's with young people, but you can draw on that experience, come and talk to people, do a seminar. What I'd say, though, is don't be shy about being honest about what your resources are taking from that. Now, if the corporate's giving you 100 grand, then maybe one seminar doesn't feel like too much skin off your nose to do that. But if it's a relatively new or small relationship, you should be making them aware if there are costs involved and not worry about asking or charging for those services as well. So that would be my one caveat that I'd say to building those partnerships is managing expectations on what is reasonable to ask in terms of the give-get relationship. But also I do think it is a very powerful way of building that relationship, building stakeholders, and ultimately making that relationship as sticky as possible. You want to retain your relationships, you want to grow them in terms of whether it be funding, volunteer impact, whatever it is, that ultimately we want these long-term partnerships and we want them to be successful. So it's another great way of getting that relationship and partnership to build.
Wow, brilliant. Thank you so much. So look, thank you so much to Kate. Could I just have a round of applause? That was fantastic. Really appreciate you taking the time, Kate.